Okay, so I've been having trouble fully realizing videos and really kind of figuring out what I need to do. I have a ton of ideas, but I don't have a teleprompter and I'm having trouble just fully fleshing out ideas for videos. So I think I'm going to just start talking and maybe just talking about my life to get it rolling. I'm often told that I'm a good storyteller, so I figured I would use this platform to do just that. So today I think I'm going to talk about my early life a bit. I was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1976. My parents were Neil and Lou Butler. They both came from very working class families, not a lot of education in the backgrounds before their era. My dad had a bachelor's degree, and my mom had a nursing degree and went through college as well. My parents met through my uncle Tim because he and my dad worked together at a bike shop as mechanics. And he brought my dad home for dinner one day, and he met Tim's sister, who was my mom. I was born shortly after them getting married, and from everything that I was aware of, it was a very good and loving home. At least it seemed that way to me. So I really had a great childhood, and my early years have some very fond memories. Some of my earliest memories are going to the fair with my parents and being with my family quite a bit. My grandmother lived just within walking distance of the house we were in until I was 9 or 10. And we spent a ton of time there with my grandma and grandfather and my uncles as well. My dad had a sister that lived here as well, and she still lives here, my Aunt Karen. And we didn't see them quite as often. They lived a little further away, but we just didn't see them quite as much. And then his other sister lived in Seattle. My dad's mother died when he was around 13, I believe. And obviously, I never met her. And then his father died when I was probably 4 or 5. And being at his funeral was one of my earliest memories. I do remember him somewhat being around a bit, but it's not really clear. So, yeah, I believe I was 4 or 5 when he passed away. So I didn't get much time with him to have a lot of memories since I don't really remember much before being 3 or 4. So my dad was a really great father to me. He spent a ton of time with me and took me to a lot of Suns games. I remember going camping a ton. We would fish multiple times a month together out on one of the lakes here in Arizona. And we just spent a ton of time together. Played basketball in the driveway. Anything you can think of, my dad did it with me. He was, at the time, an accountant and worked for a company who he was also the vice president of. That would later change and change our financial situation as well. My mother also was very loving and very involved with me. She did work some, but was also stay at home some, if memory serves me correctly, and would eventually go into nursing school and become a nurse full time as I got a little older. I think it was around first or second grade where my mother went into nursing school, and I believe my dad had laid out a bunch of the money for it in advance, and then he got laid off from the company he'd worked with, which also blacklisted him because the owner of the company went to prison, I believe, for some cocaine charges and maybe money laundering, etc. But I've never quite got the full story on that, and my dad has since passed away, so I'm not really sure. And my mother passed away when I was about 20, so I can't really ask them. My uncles may have some insight on it, and I may ask them someday. But I don't ever remember us going without. But looking back, I often remember us eating a lot of very budget meals like chip beef on toast and stuff for a while. So I guess we were really poor at the time, but they didn't let me know that, and I had no awareness of it whatsoever. They were just great parents and really always took care of me and then later on my sister. My mother had ovarian cancer when I was probably 4 or 5, and they had to remove her ovaries, rendering her unable to have another child. So around when I was 6, we adopted my sister, Elizabeth. We called her Libby. She now goes by Liz. And the family dynamic obviously changed some, but was always really great. My sister and I would say, didn't really get along great, but we definitely coexisted and existed together as well. Eventually, my dad bought a small accounting firm and he built it up pretty well. I remember helping him put the office together. It was probably around 3rd grade, maybe. And I remember us buying used office furniture and all kinds of stuff and him putting an office together. And that was in East Phoenix. And we lived in South Scottsdale at the time. So it wasn't a real far trip for him, but eventually around 4th grade, we moved over to East Phoenix, right near where his office was. At one point, we had a foster sister who was a teenager. My mother was really, really into helping people, and she adopted this girl, Tiffany, who didn't stay with us for very long. She ran away a lot, but I remember her pretty fondly, and she was always really nice to me, but it just didn't last for very long. And I think that was the only time we fostered anyone. But my mother, I remember her even bringing over families from Mexico through the church to stay with us and to learn about their culture and stuff. She was really into church, and when she passed away, she was actually studying to change careers and become a Methodist minister. Sometimes her love for religion and my love for heavy metal intersected in not great ways, but she was pretty liberal with allowing me to be into a lot of it. I do remember her having me sit down with our minister when I was in elementary school when the album Number of the Beast came into our home, and him explaining the book of Revelations to me, etc. But she was pretty good about kind of letting me find my own path and be my own self. My uncles were musicians, as was my grandfather, and my grandmother played piano and organ too, and my great grandma also played piano. So music was always around, and I was pretty early on drawn to the hard stuff. My uncles listened to a lot of reggae, but they were also into bands like ZZ Top that really grabbed my attention, and also AC/DC and some other more hard rock from the 70s that I really liked. We definitely had an odd relationship with religion. We were very involved in the church, as were my grandmother and grandfather. We spent a lot of time there. My parents led youth groups and all kinds of stuff. Even when we changed to a different church after we moved, they were very, very involved. My dad never went to church except for Christmas and Easter, and I don't think it was ever really his thing. He was raised Catholic and not Methodist, and I just don't think he was really into religion much at all. We didn't talk about it a ton, but I'm pretty sure it just wasn't his thing. As much as I kind of despise religion as a teenager and kind of still now, mostly organized religion, it played just a huge role in my growing up, and mainly just because we were at the church all the time. It did lead me to some really great people who are still in my life, namely a family named the Carlises, and two of their boys are named Heckman. So Gordon Heckman is still one of my best friends, and we eventually played music together in the band Wellington, and to this day we still spend Christmas and Thanksgiving together at least at some point. And I go to his family's house, and they're kind of like my second family. They're just really great people, and I'm really thankful that I met them and still have them. And that was all because of going to church. Funny, they're not really involved in church anymore, but they kind of have similar feelings about organized religion, I believe, that I do. I talked about this a bit in my Paul Diano video, but directly across the street from us was a kid named James who was the same age as me. I ended up hanging out with him quite a bit, and he lived with his two older cousins. I think this was probably around when I was 6 or 7, like first or second grade maybe. And I still just can't pinpoint exactly what year I started hanging out with James and his cousins, but they led me down the path of heavy metal for sure. I was into the hard rock, but they turned me on to Iron Maiden and Judas Priest and Accept and all kinds of bands like that. And Iron Maiden being the ultimate one for me that I really latched onto with the imagery and the music. And those guys just really paved the way for a musical path for me through my life. The two older cousins' mother, Paula, ended up becoming one of my mother's best friends up until she passed away. They were really great friends, and I ended up meeting up with Paula a few times throughout my life after my mother passed away, but didn't remain close with her. And I'm not sure where James or his cousins are anymore. One of her sons, Richard, still lived with her the last time I saw her. My dad came into town and we met up with them, and Richard came over for dinner as well. So as I was going into 4th grade, we moved to East Phoenix, which, looking back, seemed like it was a million miles away, but now I know it's only probably 2 or 3 miles between the two houses. But still, we didn't see my grandmother and grandfather quite as much when we moved over there, and my relationship with James definitely suffered from us moving over there. I saw him a few times after that. I would have him over for birthday parties and stuff like that, but we definitely drifted apart. But I ended up meeting some new friends in that area and definitely furthering my heavy metal journey even more. Even though it wasn't with my friends too much, I just soldiered on by myself listening to it. I would have some friends here and there that were into it, but they kind of came in and out of my life. My friend Robert, when I lived over there, was pretty into heavy metal, but he was also into rap and a bunch of different things too. So he got me into Beastie Boys and some different stuff and kind of opened my mind to some other things, but heavy metal was still definitely my thing. When we moved over there, I eventually ended up meeting Gordon, but Gordon was 2 or 3 years younger than me. I could never remember because my memory's terrible, but over the next few years, we would become closer and closer. We were definitely kind of church buddies, but we would hang out outside of church as well. And when high school came around, we definitely hung out a lot and then ended up being in a band together. When I first started playing bass, 8th grade or freshman year, Gordon and I would jam too, even before we had a band. We would just put on records on his stereo. He played drums and I would play bass, and we would just kind of jam along to music or just make up stuff together. But we didn't have a real formal band until I was probably 17, and he, I want to say, was 15. I think we took him on his first tour, maybe even before he was 16, which is funny. We even took him into Canada, and I think they had to call his parents at the border to make sure we weren't kidnapping him. I remember one friend over there named Justin Barrett who was really, really into heavy metal, and we got pretty deep into it together. But he was kind of a spitfire, and we ended up fighting, and he ended up getting in fights with everyone at the school all the time. And he eventually left the school. He came back to that same school system in high school, but a lot of people remembered him. And I think he kind of got chased out of that school, but I'm not sure. My memory's a little foggy about that. It was a bummer because we were really good friends and he was really into some different hard edge stuff that he turned me on to, but we just ended up parting ways real quick. And I remember even getting in some fist fights with him. My great grandmother, however, lived in the area that we moved to, and she was probably 3/4 of a mile away from my house, probably like a short bike ride. And I would often spend time over there, or she would sometimes watch us after school or take us places that we need to go to the doctor or whatever. I remember spending a lot of time with her over there. Somewhere around this time, my dad ended up bringing my grandfather, my mother's dad, in as a partner into his accounting firm. That didn't end up working out, and I believe it was due to financial reasons. So they parted ways, and not long after that, my grandfather passed away from a heart attack. It created a bit of a rift in the family as my grandmother sort of blamed my father for causing him undue stress. So I do remember a Thanksgiving and a Christmas where we went out of town for Thanksgiving, and I don't think we went over to see them for Christmas, which was kind of unfair to us as kids. But looking back, I understand how, as an adult, it's hard to deal with those kinds of situations. It did end up mending itself eventually, but there was another issue that I'm not really sure that I should talk about between my mother and my grandmother and my grandfather as well that caused some tension between them. So we did end up coming back together as a family, though my grandmother and my dad never really got along well after that. My dad moved to Montana after my mother died, and I was out of high school. And I remember when my sister was graduating from high school, my grandmother and my uncle went up there to see her graduate. And I believe there was an issue with how my sister was living, and she was having a baby at the time, and they weren't really happy with the state of her house. And my grandmother and my uncle ended up getting in a fight with her and leaving without my dad knowing. This upset my dad a bit because I guess he had prepared his trailer for them to stay in, and they didn't even tell him that they left. So I don't think that he and one of my uncles or my grandmother ever spoke again after that, but I am not quite sure. My dad did come down to Phoenix for my wedding to my wife, Amy, which was long after that, and they both were there, and we only had our parents and my grandparents there, but I can't remember if they talked or not, and I don't know if they talked at the dinner afterwards. It's kind of a sad thing, but it just is what it is, especially now at this point that they're both gone. So my dad was really into travel trailers and boats, and even when we lived in South Scottsdale, we always had this aluminum boat that he had even up in Montana. And he started buying older travel trailers when I was really young, probably not long after my sister was born, but I can't remember the timelines exactly. So we went from camping in tents all the time to camping in travel trailers, which prompted my mom to come more because she didn't really like roughing it very much. When we moved over to East Phoenix, my dad was still into boats and trailers, and we kept camping and fishing and boating all the time. I ended up joining the Boy Scout troop that was at my school in the fourth grade, and my dad ended up becoming assistant scoutmaster. And he went on the majority of the trips with us, and he really, really loved it. So I have a lot of good memories from Boy Scouts with my dad. And I eventually became an Eagle Scout when I was in high school. My dad was always really one of my biggest supporters. He was a lot like me in that he was kind of uncomfortable in showing affection, but he did do it, and he was just always there for me and was always there to take me to do things that I enjoyed and that he enjoyed doing with me. He spent the majority of the time I was in Scouts as the assistant, and then I think sixth grade I started riding mountain bikes, and my dad was the Arizona State road cycling champion for 3 years. So he was really into bikes, and he was a former bike mechanic, and he ended up just taking care of my bikes all the time. And then I started racing mountain bikes for a shop in Tempe, and the races were all over the state, and he would take me and some of my friends to the races, and we would camp there, and we would be able to pre-ride the course because he would take us up a day or two before, and we could ride the course and check it out before we raced it. And those are some really great memories of mine too. I remember going to Yuma, Prescott, Payson, Flagstaff, just all over the state to every race with my dad, and it was really a lot of fun. My pops was always my biggest fan. He hated the music I played. He hated heavy metal. He hated punk rock. He hated hardcore. He called death metal dead metal. And when he heard me playing the Bad Brains one time, he called them the Dead Brains, and forever called them the Dead Brains. He had no idea who they were, but he would always ask me if I still listened to the Dead Brains or dead metal music. And he was a card and always had something goofy to say. But when I started playing music a lot, he supported me in that as well. He helped me trade my car in when I was 17 to get a van, and eventually let us go on the road in that van while I was still in high school. My mom was one of the most loving and caring individuals you could ever meet. She really meant a lot to everybody, and when she passed away right after I graduated high school, it really broke everyone's heart, mine included, and still to this day is really rough for me to think about how my mom didn't get to really see me become an adult. She missed out on a lot of stuff, and I really missed her being involved with that. Thankfully, my dad made it up until 2017, and he was there for me through a lot of stuff. Though we did have some points where he moved away to Montana right after my mom passed away, and he kind of cut off communication a bit. A theory that a lot of my family friends have is that I reminded him so much of my mom that he kind of distanced himself from me for a bit. When he moved to Montana, he and my mom had been discussing doing it to get my sister out of some trouble she'd been in here. And he decided to just go ahead and do it anyways after she passed away. I went up there for the first Christmas that he was up there. And then he ended up meeting a woman named Dee Dee, and they eventually got married. He brought me up there for the wedding. And then he also attended my first wedding in 1999. And then he kind of disappeared from my life for a bit. The only time I would really talk to him is when he would do my taxes. And I'm not sure why that was, but he didn't reach out. I would try, and I would send him Christmas gifts and birthday cards and birthday gifts and never even hear a thank you or anything from him. He just really disappeared for a while, and it was a tough time for me to go through that. My mom passed away in 1996. He moved up there in 1997. I got married in 99, and I think he got married in 98. And after my wedding, he just wasn't there for me anymore. Somewhere around maybe 2003 or 2004, he had a cancer scare and said that he was going to try and be more involved with me. And then his wife, Dee Dee, ended up passing away from an ulcer that burst in her stomach, and she just didn't get treated in time to save her. That really brought him back more into my life, and I think he kind of learned to appreciate more what he had and who he could rely on and who was around him. He usually flew me up to Montana once a year at least, maybe every other year from then on, or came down here, and I'm really glad he did that, and I have a lot of special memories from that. There was one time after he got VA disability where he took us all to Disneyland and met us there too, and that was just one of my most favorite trips of all time. We went there with my wife Amy and my sister and her husband and their daughter Katie at the time. So we ended up being pretty close for his remaining years after 2004. And I'm really, really happy that it was that way. He would call all the time, and we really communicated pretty well. So my parents treated my sister and I really well, whether we were financially well off or not. We were definitely not financially well off in my early years of elementary school, but my dad's business definitely started taking off a bit more as I went through elementary school, and my mom got her nursing degree and became a nurse. And we didn't really go without from then on, from what memory serves me well. Or at least if we did, they didn't make us aware of it at all. We were very well taken care of, and I have nothing but really good things to say about my childhood with my family. In middle school, I definitely started getting more into alternative cultures, like listening to punk rock and deeper into heavy metal and then indie rock and all kinds of different stuff, alternative music, what they called it at the time. And I had a good friend named Jake who lived behind our house, and we became pretty close, I think, in 8th grade. And then freshman year of high school, his parents ended up going to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a law where high school age Americans aren't allowed to live there. So Jake ended up going to military school in the US, and his parents went to Saudi Arabia. So that split up our friendship, and he was kind of one of my only really close friends at the time. And I floundered for a little bit, not really knowing what to do with him leaving. I ended up making friends with some skater kids and started drifting away from mountain biking, and I was skateboarding quite a bit and getting even deeper into punk rock. These guys were all into punk rock, and it really drew me into it, and I started going to shows more. I also had a really good friend through Scouts named Greg, and he was a little older than me and could drive, and he took me to some of my first punk shows, and I have a lot of really good memories hanging out with him as well. Him being a little older sometimes didn't let us be quite as close, because just being a couple years older, you often do different activities and stuff, but we were pretty good buddies until we drifted apart later down the line. He got into mountain biking a bit for a while too, if I remember right, and Jake also was into mountain biking. So I ended up making friends with this guy Brian and another guy named Mike who ended up being in Unruh and Wellington and some other bands, and I met them through mountain biking, and they were also both into skateboarding, funny enough. But we all kind of left mountain biking behind as we got deep into skating and kind of the punk rock culture through high school. High school was a little more difficult for me. Most of my friends were older than me at that point. I was definitely dressing more punk rock and stood out like a sore thumb. I went to a school that had two different feeder elementary schools where we all met in middle school. One was the very wealthy side of this area, and the other school where I went was more of the average middle class kids and lower middle class kids. And when we met in middle school, it slowly kind of grew into a class war here and there, literally classes and class. But being punk rock was definitely not cool before, 1994, 1995, probably. So I had a rough time of it with some of the people at school. Funny enough, some of the people that gave me the most grief at that school was the drummer of my first punk rock band and his group of friends. They were all kids that went to that more wealthy elementary school, and they all started to lean very right wing. I became very punk rock and very left leaning, went vegetarian then vegan, and they didn't like that at all. And a few of them, this one guy, Zach, really did not like me for some reason and kind of never would really let me be accepted into that group. These guys disliked me so much that they would actually throw meat at me during lunch because I was a vegetarian and they thought that sucked and that I was a wimp or whatever. So they would torture me quite often to the point where I almost switched schools and went to where some of my more punk rock and skateboarding friends went. But the funny thing that happened was my dad's cousin, who we called Uncle Don, became the vice principal of my high school. His name was also Butler, and they stopped messing with me then, as well as the jocks stopped messing with me. So my last year and a half of high school played out in relative peace, and I ended up hanging out a lot more with people that went to another high school in Scottsdale that were more my type of folks. I had a really good friend that was female that went to the school, and she and her friend ate lunch with me, etc. But they were a year or two behind me, and in high school, that's like a million years. So sometimes we always didn't end up doing the same things together, and she and I drifted apart eventually too. Mike and Brian had graduated at that point, so it was just kind of me left on my own. And even when they were there, they were a different year, so their lunch times were different times than mine, so I didn't even get to meet up with them at lunch. The funny thing about schooling for me is after elementary school, I started to really, really enjoy learning and reading and going to school to learn. And that continued on with me through college. And I probably would have gone on to get a 4-year degree if I was better at math, but I didn't think that I could even pass what I needed to get a bachelor's degree in math. So I also wanted to be a recording engineer anyways, and a bachelor's degree wouldn't have helped me with that at all. My parents did what they could to make life easier for me and my sister, and were always in our corner. I remember my dad sitting down with the principal when these guys were just torturing me, but there was not much that they could really do. It just sucked that I was by myself and there was a big group of them. So what was I going to do to stop them? When the football players messed with me, it was usually one-on-one, thankfully, and I eventually ended up punching one of them in the face, and it scared him straight, and they stopped messing with me after that. So, with the exception of the social aspect, I really loved school and I loved learning and I loved reading. I loved playing music in school. I joined the orchestra in fourth grade, playing mostly viola, and I did it until I graduated high school. And I was close with several of my orchestra teachers. My last orchestra teacher, Tasha, in high school, I even house sat her house for an entire summer after I graduated. She was really amazing and really supported me a lot in my music, even outside of orchestra. So, in a nutshell, I really did have a great upbringing and a wonderful childhood, and my parents really did the best they could to make it that way. I'm really grateful to them for really always being in my corner up until the end. I am still kind of the person I was then. Now, I still really enjoy the outdoors and alternative type sports, biking, punk rock, music, heavy metal, all those things, camping that I enjoyed back then. It really formed me as a person. And my father and mother really helped form my values. And my mother really instilled in me that you should always be kind to other people as much as you can and try and help where you can. So that's a little bit of a story of my early years. Thanks for listening.